In October 1971, the roar of V8 engines echoed through Mount Panorama as the most powerful machines in the world lined up for Australia's greatest race. But among them sat an unlikely contender, a six-cylinder car that looked out of place, yet would soon rewrite history. This wasn't just a competitor, it was a revolution on wheels. What followed would shake the foundations of Australian motorsport and threaten the global automotive hierarchy itself. So shocking was its success that whispers spread about efforts to bury its legacy. This is the untold story of the engine that refused to die, the men who pushed it to its limits, and the quiet rebellion that nearly toppled the mighty V8s. By the dawn of the 1970s, Chrysler Australia was in trouble. Their rivals, Ford and Holden, were national icons, their homegrown V8s dominating roads, races, and headlines. Chrysler, on the other hand, was lagging behind, still relying on the aging slant six engine, dependable but outdated. Yet deep within the engineering offices at Chrysler's Tonsley Park plant in Adelaide, a visionary named Maurice or Maury Harkis was planning something extraordinary. His mission was clear: build an engine capable of taking on the V8s, powerful, efficient, and affordable. His foundation came from a scrapped American truck engine prototype, his inspiration the legendary Hemi V8. But instead of simply copying Detroit, Harkis and his small team, including brilliant engineer John Westlake, would evolve the idea into something uniquely Australian. They reimagined the hemispherical combustion chamber into a semi-Hemi or polyspherical design, a clever compromise that allowed larger valves and better airflow without the bulk or expense of a full Hemi. What they built was a masterpiece of mechanical efficiency and balance. They called it the Hemi 6, and it would change everything. The first production version, the 245 cubic inch Hemi 6, was tough, light, and efficient. It replaced the slant 6 entirely, offering 165 horsepower, a solid jump over its predecessor, and better fuel economy to match. It wasn't just a workhorse, it was a new heartbeat for the Australian Valiant. But as the horsepower wars escalated, Chrysler knew they needed something more formidable. Ford had unleashed the monstrous Falcon GTHO Phase 3 with its 351 V8, while Holden's Monaro carried GM's full support. Chrysler had no choice but to fight back harder. In 1970, the company bored the Hemi 6 out to 265 cubic inches, 4.3 liters, boosting output to 205 horsepower and 273 pound-foot of torque. The new V8 Valiant Pacer was a genuine muscle car, capable of sprinting from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 7.6 seconds and running a quarter mile under 16. For a six-cylinder sedan, it was astonishing. The Pacer proved that Chrysler's Australian engineers could go head-to-head with Detroit's finest and sometimes even beat them. But the engineers at Tonsley Park weren't satisfied. They wanted to build something that could humiliate the V8s. Their search for more power led them far from home, all the way to Bologna, Italy. There, the carburetor masters at Weber had perfected the art of side draft carburation. Working together, Chrysler's engineers and Weber's experts created a radical triple carburetor setup, 3 Weber 45 DCOE side draft carbs mounted on a custom manifold. This setup would come to be known as the Six Pack, and it transformed the Hemi 265 into a ferocious race-bred engine. The development wasn't easy. The setup was so complex that Chrysler's engineers nicknamed it the Headache. But the performance was undeniable. Reinforced with forged pistons, a high-lift camshaft, and heavy-duty valve springs, the engine became nearly indestructible. Its internals, including a forged steel crankshaft supported by 7 main bearings, gave it the strength to rev safely past 6,000 RPM. The result was breathtaking. In its ultimate form, the E49, the 265 Hemi Six Pack produced a staggering 302 horsepower and 320 pound-foot of torque. Officially, those numbers were conservative. Most insiders believe the real output was much higher. What truly stunned people was its torque delivery. It pulled ferociously from idle, accelerating like a freight train all the way to redline. When journalists tested the E49, they were speechless. Wheels magazine recorded 0 to 60 miles per hour in 6.1 seconds and a quarter mile in just 14.4, faster than Ford's mighty GTHO Falcon Phase 3. For a six-cylinder to outperform the country's most revered V8 was unthinkable. Australia had found its homegrown giant killer. Racing drivers like Leo and Ian Gogian fell in love with the Charger's power and balance. Leo described it best: it was a rocket. The torque was phenomenal. You could leave the V8s behind out of corners. It wasn't a car, it was a weapon. Even Peter Brock, long before his Holden fame, drove a Hemi Six Pack Charger and praised its handling, saying its lighter front end made it far more agile through Bathurst's tricky sections. The 1971 V8 Valiant Charger RT was the ultimate expression of this vision, a sleek two-door coupe built around the ferocious Hemi 6. Available in several trims, its most feared variants were the E38 and E49. Both featured the six-pack setup, but the E49 took it to extremes with higher compression, revised gearing, and improved fuel delivery. It was raw, loud, and utterly unstoppable, the definitive Australian muscle machine. At its heart, the E49's engineering was a triumph of simplicity and strength. Its iron block was light yet durable. The semi-hemispherical head design allowed massive valves, 1.84-inch intake and 1.60-inch exhaust for optimal breathing. Compression ratios of up to 10:1 and precision-tuned carburation gave it instant throttle response. It was built to rev, to fight, and to win. But its success came at a cost. The E49's dominance at Bathurst was a shock to the industry. Its performance embarrassed larger, more expensive V8s and threatened the marketing empires behind them. In the aftermath, corporate politics, cost pressures, and the looming fuel crisis began to close in. The six-pack's light burned bright but briefly. Production ended not long after, leaving behind a legend that refused to fade. The Chrysler 265 Hemi Six Pack remains one of the most iconic engines ever built, not because of how many were made, but because of what it represented: innovation over imitation, precision over power, and the relentless spirit of underdogs who refused to surrender. The E49's camshaft was an engineering masterpiece, a high-lift 0.480-inch grind that opened the valves wider and held them open longer, allowing massive airflow at high revs. Heavy-duty valve springs ensured stability all the way to its 6,500 RPM redline, eliminating valve float even under brutal racing conditions. And then came the heart of its legend, the six-pack. 3 side-draft Weber 45 DCOE carburetors, each a precision Italian creation, sat proudly on a custom-designed manifold. This wasn't a gimmick or marketing trick, it was pure mechanical artistry. The center carburetor handled cruising duties, while the outer two came alive under heavy throttle, feeding the engine a perfectly balanced mixture of fuel and air. Tuning was meticulous. The ratios were kept around 12.5:1 for ideal torque and combustion efficiency. The exhaust system was just as special. Enlarged headers at 1.75 inches fed a true dual-exit setup that gave the Hemi six-pack its unmistakable sound, a raw, metallic snarl deeper than any four-cylinder and sharper than most V8s. Chrysler's engineers knew that speed was useless without durability, so they reinforced every weak point. A harmonic damper was added to tame crankshaft vibrations, the connecting rods were shot-peened to resist fatigue, and a windage tray minimized oil aeration at high revs. Later models even received electronic ignition for cleaner, more precise spark timing. Despite its strength, the Hemi six-pack was astonishingly light, around 500 pounds, nearly 200 less than a typical V8, giving the Charger a remarkable power-to-weight advantage. This wasn't a mild upgrade, it was a complete transformation. Every internal component was purpose-built for performance. Compression ratios climbed from 9.5:1 to 10.1 in the E49, aided by forged pistons, strengthened rods, and high-lift cams. When combined with the upgraded exhaust, the result was an engine that screamed to life with a voice unlike anything else on Australian roads: savage, relentless, and alive. But the road to perfection wasn't easy. Early prototypes suffered detonation under Australia's harsh heat, and the 3 Webers demanded precise synchronization to avoid flooding or lean surges. Yet Chrysler's engineers refused to quit. They hand-selected the strongest blocks, strapped engines to dynos that shook the floors of the Tonsley Park plant, and pushed them until they broke, then rebuilt them stronger. By 1971, the results spoke for themselves. The E38 made 248 horsepower and 305 pound-feet of torque, while the 1972 E49 pushed things even further with 302 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. What began as an economical inline-six had evolved into a torque monster that surged relentlessly from 2,000 to 6,500 RPM. The motoring press was stunned. Wheels and modern motor recorded 0 to 60 miles per hour in 6.1 seconds, 0 to 100 miles per hour in just over 14, and a top speed past 130 miles per hour. The quarter-mile times fell in the mid-14s, equal to or better than Detroit's revered 340 V8s. Yet the Hemi Six Pack wasn't a gas guzzler. It delivered up to 20 mpd on the highway. One journalist summed it up perfectly. It pulls like a V8, revs like a sports car, and sips fuel like an economy sedan. Soon, stories of its dominance spread like wildfire. One legendary tale told of an E38 Charger outrunning a police Falcon on a Melbourne highway. When the officer opened the hood expecting a V8, he was stunned to see 6 cylinders staring back. Mechanics called it the Sleeper Six, quiet, modest, and absolutely lethal when unleashed. When Chrysler homologated the E49 for Bathurst with 200 production units, the intent was clear. They were coming for the V8s. With its peak torque arriving at 3,500 RPM, the Hemi was built for the punishing climbs and sharp descents of Mount Panorama. Ford and Holden's big V8s had long ruled the straights, but Chrysler's lighter Charger could carry far more speed through the corners. It wasn't just fast, it was strategic. Then came Bathurst 1971. The atmosphere crackled with tension as 60,000 fans crowded the fences. The mighty Ford Falcon GTHO Phase 3 with its 351 Cleveland V8 was the clear favorite. Holden's Toronto GTR XU1s offered agility, but Chrysler's E38 Charger, smaller, lighter, and armed with its 65 Hemi Six Pack, was the wild card. When the flag dropped, the inline-six roared to life, climbing skyline with the ferocity of a V8. Leo J. Gann's Charger chased down the leaders, devouring the mountain's twists and straights with effortless torque. Tire blowouts and mechanical failures crippled the heavier V8s, but the Hemi Six Pack kept pushing. When the checkered flag waved, Chrysler crossed the line in third, but in the eyes of fans, it was a moral victory. Newspapers blared 6 beats 8, and crowds chanted Hemi, Hemi at the pits. In 1972, the E49 arrived to settle unfinished business. Boasting 302 horsepower, it was faster, sharper, and ready to rewrite the record books. Kevin Bartlett and Doug Kivas took to Mount Panorama in their E49s, battling Ford and Holden's finest. The lightweight Charger's agility and torque made it devastating in corners and unbeatable in endurance. When V8s sputtered from fuel stops and brake fade, the Hemi surged on. Even rival drivers couldn't deny its brilliance. Alan Moffat famously grumbled, "That damn six sounds like a chainsaw, but it won't die." But just as the Hemi Six Pack reached its peak, a storm was brewing. In 1972, the supercar scare hit Australia, a media frenzy over road-legal race cars like Ford's Phase 4 Falcon, Holden's V8 Monaro, and Chrysler's E49. Newspapers branded them killer cars, sparking public outrage. Politicians reacted swiftly, insurance rates skyrocketed, and performance cars suddenly became targets. But beneath the headlines lay something more sinister. Chrysler Australia's success had embarrassed Detroit. The American parent company didn't want an Australian-built six-cylinder outperforming its prized V8s. Memos reportedly circulated urging Chrysler Australia to align with global strategies, a polite way of saying, stop building engines that made the US V8s look bad. With mounting emissions rules and political pressure, the E49 program was quietly shut down. Only around 150 were ever built before the axe fell. Insiders whispered of interference from rival automakers and even oil companies. A high-efficiency 6 didn't sell enough fuel. Insurance rates were deliberately hiked to kill demand. By 1973, the once feared six-pack was gone, replaced by the detuned E48 with a simple 2-barrel carburetor. For Chrysler's engineers, it was a heartbreak. They had created an engine that rivaled the world's best, and it was buried by politics and corporate fear. Rumors of a secret E55 prototype with quad carbs and Wilder cams still circulate today, said to have been hidden away before Chrysler's collapse in 1981. Some claim a final E49 engine remains sealed in a Melbourne warehouse, the last of its kind, waiting to roar again. Today, the legend lives on. Restored E49 Chargers command prices over $200,000 Australian dollars and roar once again in heritage races at Bathurst, their triple Webers howling in defiance. Modern tuners extract over 450 naturally aspirated horsepower from the Hemi 6 with EFI and stroker kits, proving how far ahead of its time it was. Its semi-hemispherical design inspired later turbo inline sixes from BMW and Mercedes, a lasting legacy of efficiency and strength. The 265 Hemi Six Pack may have been silenced by politics, but its spirit refuses to die. It remains Australia's ultimate underdog, a six-cylinder that dared to challenge the V8s. And for a brief, glorious moment, it won.